I think it's time we reevaluated Iron Man 3. When it first came out, a lot of people thought that Shane Black's storytelling quirks made for a film that was tonally dissonant from the product they were promised. People were expecting a story that was akin to The Dark Knight, after its trailers depicted Tony Stark as misguided and broken following the events of the Avengers. And, as I'm sure a lot of you already know, that wasn't exactly what we got. But while a lot of people found this movie disappointing, I've always loved it. I happen to think that Shane Black's approach to storytelling was a great fit for the MCU's style of constant bathos, or the use of humor to downplay an emotional moment within a story. On a side note, I highly recommend checking out this video from the YouTube channel Just Right. It's a great look at bathos within the MCU and why it can hinder the storytelling within these movies. The video is also a really good counterpoint to my argument here, so you might be into that if you disagree with me. I don't know. I'm not trying to take a definite stance on whether or not bathos is a good or a bad thing. I'm just saying that I think it was compatible with the story of Iron Man 3. You see, poor Tony Stark went through a lot in the Avengers. He found out there were gods and aliens, he slowly learned how to play well with others, and he confronted his mortality. Again. So for him to go from playing badass to AC/DC to having a plucky sidekick in Iron Man 3 is a pretty big deal. After all, his entire understanding of the world has just been shattered. In both of his previous movies, he's always maintained that it was his responsibility to use his suits for good. He didn't even think that anyone else should have an Iron Man suit because he is Iron Man.
I am Iron Man. The suit and I are one. To turn over the Iron Man suit would be to turn over myself, which is tantamount to indentured servitude or prostitution, depending on what state you're in.
And in a lot of ways, I think that Stark's behavior in Iron Man 3 is the perfect permutation of that line of thinking. After working alongside the other Avengers, he's worried that he isn't able to carry his weight on the team. His experiences made him realize that he's just a man in a can.
You experience things, and then they're over and you still can't explain them? Gods, aliens, other dimensions, I'm just a man in a can.
Anything the world can throw at him would seem small by comparison because his expectations towards danger have been tempered dramatically. I'm sure you're wondering how bathos plays into this. Well, I think that the repeated use of anticlimax is appropriate because through downplaying what Tony's up against, Shane Black is telling the viewer that even Tony finds this somewhat trivial after what he's been through. I mean, think about it. Stark went from fighting an army of aliens being led by a homicidal god to this dude.
Tony, I swear to God, I'm gonna blow his face off.
I'm not trying to downplay how dangerous Killian and Extremis is, but they're probably a step or two below Loki and the Chitauri. I mean, in the first act of the movie, Rhodey explicitly says this to Tony.
Stopping the Mandarin is priority, but it's not
superhero business.
No, it's not, quite frankly. It's American business.
While Stark's definitely put in danger throughout the movie, it often has more to do with how he doesn't have a suit on him than anything.
Whatever.
And even without a suit, he's still able to improvise and make do because of his own ingenuity, which is something he wouldn't have been able to do during the Avengers. If he was ever caught without a suit in that movie, he would have been shredded by a propeller, turned into roadkill, or nuked. The events surrounding New York are still on his mind, and those thoughts are treated with seriousness, as they should be. The comedy also works in favor of the story because, well, it makes sense. It totally adds up that Stark would be the kind of person who tries to hide from his problems behind a wall of bravado.
Here's my home address. 10880 Malibu Point.
And it also makes sense that this would blow up in his face in a funny way.
Are we still at Ding Dong? We're supposed to be on total security lockdown. Come on, I threatened a terrorist. Who is that?
By minimizing the threats present in this movie, Black is reinforcing how world-changing the threats from the Avengers were and using that to define where Stark is mentally. I can see how people are bothered by the MCU's reliance on bathos. Even within the context of Iron Man 3, I can see how it's a negative that the movie's invalidating its own conflict in order to validate character motivation. But hey, the MCU usually has pretty weak villains, and the movie came out 5 years ago. What's doing anything aside from constructively trying to make sense out of it gonna do at this point? I walked into Iron Man 3 expecting the same thing everyone else did. a darker, more socially conscious Marvel film that was gonna root the MCU back in reality after the Avengers. But I was pleasantly surprised by Iron Man 3 and how it elected to be a funner movie-going experience than it told us it would be. And at the end of the day, the movie did pack a few punches emotionally. It depicted Tony Stark as obsessive after what he had gone through, and it gave him a nice arc of relearning that he's Iron Man and that the suit doesn't define him, but rather his actions with or without the suit do.
Can you feel that? We're done here.